Okay, we should be set.
Okay, it looks like we have a quorum. We'll call this meeting to order at 2:03 p.m. We'll start with the approval of minutes. If everyone has had a chance to look at the January 13th regular meeting minutes. Any concerns, questions, edits, anything we want to talk about before
I did have some edits. Did you guys see them?
I saw them, Arnie, but I did not pass them on to Summer, but I can, if you want to reference them in your motion, I can send them along to her.
Do I need to explain to the board what they are? They're just where I was somewhat misquoted in the minutes. I can find them here if you want me to.
You might as well for the record. It's good for the public to know too.
Okay, well, hang on here. You can see me, but I can't see you, but I've got to go back and find that email, which I just had in my hand a second ago. So, because I thought I might need it.
I did just send them to Summer, so our recorder will certainly have them.
Mm-hmm. Where'd it go? My goodness. Really? Oh, hang on, folks. Sorry.
You're all good.
Yeah, it was in my sent box. Here it is. I have a few corrections for last month's minute. First, the last sentence on page 1 states he said the biggest cost will be the capital expenses associated with the ongoing monitoring. And what I would like it to say is the biggest cost will be the capital expenses associated with implementing the plan. The annual expenses will be relatively inexpensive. Then on the second page, the third page, full paragraph on page 4 states, Board Vice Chair Holtquist said the UGS and USGS have been reaching out to put the safe yield discussion on the MOP agenda for the virtual MOP meeting. And it should read, the UGS and the USGS have been reaching out to put the state of the science discussion on the groundwater availability in Spanish Valley on the agenda for the MOPS virtual meeting in March. And then lastly, it says he inquired if the saved water would be utilized during a shortage. And it should read, he inquired if the amount of saved water with that scenario would be enough to mitigate the shortages due to long-term drought. That's all I had on changes to the minutes. Uh-oh. Did you guys lose me?
We hear you.
You hear me? How come I can't? Oh, I know why I can't see you. There we go. Now I'm back. I can see you now. Hey, everybody. I don't have 2 screens, Jeremy. I just got one.
That's fine. Me too. Does anybody else have any other comments? Otherwise, I would make the motion to approve the minutes with the recommended changes by Arnie.
I will second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the motion passes. Board and staff reports. Does anyone have anything to speak to right now before we get to discussing the appointment of new water conservation board members?
The only thing I do want to reiterate is that we had a nice discussion with Mark Stilson and the UGS about some more groundwater monitoring, and hopefully in the next month or 2 we'll have a groundwater monitoring plan available that we can consider funding for the wetlands anyways, not necessarily upstream, but at least we'd have the lower end of the valley covered. We'll see how that goes.
Hey, Arnie, I do have a question on the subject of the next MOPS meeting. As you guys know, I've been pushing other people, not so much Mark directly, but to try to get all the various science heads together, Colm, Gardner, UGS, and all those folks, ideally during the year. And you had mentioned we might make a first crack at that sort of thing at the March meeting by Zoom, presumably at that point. Is that anything like that still in the works? You said you had, what's going on?
Yes, that it's the current state is at the mob meeting. We decided we do that. The USGS people already know about it. I guess I need to send out an invitation. The two and Water Rights knows about it, and they're all for it. Make sure the UGS knows about it, and make sure Ken Combe knows about it. But yeah, I'm going to try to dedicate an hour, if not at least 45 minutes, to state of the science discussion. And I'm probably going to let Mark Stilson lead that discussion as opposed to me lead it. Okay. But yes, the state of the science for groundwater is on the agenda for the March meeting, which is the third Wednesday of the month at 1 o'clock.
Sounds great.
Okay. Barring any other board and staff reports, just interrupt me if there are. We'll move on to item 4, discussion regarding the appointment of new water conservation and drought management advisory board members. We've had 3 applicants, Eve Tallman, Steve Getz, and Beth Malloy. I believe, correct me, Carly, that Eve and Steve are in the waiting room right now, and Beth may join us later for an opportunity for us to ask questions as well as for them. And the idea was to invite the 2 of them, Eve and Steve, into the room right now for that conversation.
Yeah, I think we'll have like one of them come at each, we can have one and then speak with them. I have some like starting questions if you want me to kick like the questioning off, but it's pretty free form. I also want to remind the board about the vacancies that we are filling. One of them was left by John Gould, who I believe was filling a county vacancy. You are not required to have someone from the county represented, but you are permitted to, right? And it's one, and we have 2 applicants that are, Steve is living in Spanish Valley, and then I believe Miss Malloy explained that she might be moving out near the golf course. So they would be the county representative. And then Eve Tallman lives here in town, so she would fulfill the requirements because she lives in the city. And
questions.
Yeah.
Does Steve live in the city or county?
I believe he lives in the county. So both Steve and then Beth will be living in the county.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question. Are our expectations here to send not necessarily a nomination, but a suggestion to the city council on 2 members? Or is it free form? We could send them for 3 and let them decide if we wanted to, or what's the expectations, Carly?
It is absolutely up to you. You make recommendations based on board assignments, and it's really like loose in the ordinance about that. The mayor will make the appointments to the city council. So it's you are making a recommendation to her who will then nominate. Does that make sense? And if you want to say, we all think they're 3 great candidates, we think the mayor should meet with all of them and make her decision, or if you want to nominate just 2 or just 1 or none of them, that is totally up to you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Summer, why don't we bring Steve in? Yes. Steve Getz. And Jeremy, do you want me to start off, or do you want to start off?
Why don't you start with your questions, and then we'll just keep rolling until we feel like we've had enough.
Can we do introductions first?
Sure.
Introductions from Steve or from like the rest of the board?
So he knows who she's talking to.
Oh, absolutely. That's a great idea.
Sure.
Steve, are you there?
It's Steve.
Mm-hmm. He's on the road calling in, so I know he was making this a priority. There he is.
Is that better?
We can hear you now.
Oh, now you're muted, but we could hear you for a second. Summer, can you unmute him?
Still muted, Steve.
There he is. We got
Better
you.
now?
Uh-huh. You're here now.
Okay.
Hi there, Steve. My name's Carly Castle. We've communicated a little bit. I'm the deputy city manager, and we want the board and some staff want to introduce themselves to you, so you know who you're talking to.
Okay.
Jeremy, why don't you start?
Sure, Jeremy Lynch, board chair, and I'm not sure we've met Steve, though we may have met in passing. Welcome today. We'll have some questions for you in just a minute, and if you have any questions for us, please feel free to ask away. We'll just go around. How about Arnie next?
Hi, Steve. I'm Arnie Holtquist. I'm on the water board. I'm also the watershed coordinator for Grand and San Juan County. I facilitate the Moab Area Watershed Partnership as part of my duties there.
Okay.
How about you go, Mike?
Yeah, nice to meet you, Steve. I don't think I've met you yet. I'm a city council rep on the water board. I'm a retired engineer. It was electronics, wasn't water, but water's been a lot of fun. So there you go.
I think I met you at Rotary once.
Ah,
Been a while.
Kyle, do you want to go next?
Yes, Steve, this is Kyle Bailey. I was on Rotary with you. I remember
Yes.
you when you first came. How long ago was that?
It's been about 11 years.
Okay. Okay. And I think you're still on Rotary, right?
I am. Yep.
Okay. Well, it's good to have you request the appointment.
Oh, thank you.
Levi?
Levi Jones, Moab City Public Works Director.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Steve.
Chuck, are you there? My city engineer might not be there right now, but Chuck Williams is also on the call.
Okay.
And then we do have my recorder, Summer Johnson. She's always monitoring in the background, but that's who you got right now.
All right. Thank you.
Steve, this is pretty free form, and we're going to let the board members sort of ask questions as they come up. But I had one just to start us off. Why don't you tell us about your interest in being on the water board?
Well, like I said in my letter, I've got a long family history of water issues, and growing up on a farm, farmers and water, pretty closely linked. And my interest in the Moab area started, I believe it was in 2019 when the Sunrise Engineering Report came out, and it showed a far lower recharge rate than it had been assumed up to that point. So that kind of perked up my ears, and then I started noticing last summer or so in the paper, the Times, there were quite a few folks filing for new well water rights, and like individuals were filing for over 6 acre feet. There were some larger ones, and so I was questioning why are these still being allowed in an area that clearly the water table hasn't been fully explored yet. So that's my main interest, is in the water table, and making sure people understand that even after years and years of studying, you always discover new things. So.
well, yeah. Well, thank you, Steve. Let me offer this little compendium, and if the rest of you disagree, by and large, in the 2 or 3 years I've been on the water board, there's 2 broad areas of interest. Because the water board was initially formed and is still required to periodically produce a water conservation report, and we've got the next update out of it is due this fall, I believe it is. So that's one broad area of interest, and of course the city is already planning for conservation measures, if that dry summers and low snowpack like we're familiar with. So that's one broad area. The other one that's been very popular is aquifer capacity. And as you know, there was USGS report in 1970, another one 2 or 3 years ago that went on for 2 or 3 years. Both of those, even the latest one, said we had some water to grow on. More recently, one of the authors of that report has done some more geochemical work and said we may be at safe yield now, and Utah now has a safe yield law, thank goodness. So that's been another broad area is aquifer capacity, because I can tell you everybody on city council, because we're trying to deal with hotels and residential growth and residential rules and so forth, wants to know how much we have to withdraw from the aquifer. So that's the two broad areas.
Yeah, I looked up I believe it was 2016 conservation report that, I don't know if it was you guys or the county did. And I read that. That seems pretty comprehensive. I also looked back through your minutes for the last 4 or 5 months, saw what kind of issues you've been working on. So there's a lot of things that are interesting that you guys are doing.
Yeah, thank you.
Can you talk about why you feel your, I guess, experience and expertise that you could bring to the water board? I know you put it on your resume, but just for the public to hear and for the water board to be reminded of.
So my main history with aquifers is, and also surface water rights, is through my family experience. And my father and my uncle were leaders in the San Luis Valley water issues for almost 50 years. So they have a real broad experience in that, and they kind of passed that down to all of us kids. I don't know if a lot of folks have an understanding or a feeling of aquifers. It's not just a recharge rate. There's lots of issues of how much storage is in with the aquifer, establishing monitoring systems to find out if your current use is actually drawing down into a water bank type situation versus just using what you get every year in your recharge. And then you also have to think about the dry years. How much reserve do you want? So if you go 2 or 3 years dry, and you start sucking into your reserve more than you planned, you need to have some kind of plan to think about how are you going to deal with that. And then the monitoring system is very crucial. That's the only way you can find out where you're at. And it probably should be a system of wells monitored probably monthly, especially during the irrigation system, to see what kind of drawdown you're getting. So there's just, I could talk for hours. And there's a scientific side, and then there's an emotional side. I listened in to a YouTube meeting that Mike was in with the state engineers, and one of the citizen comments later in the meeting, it sounded like a woman that probably has a house down in Spanish Valley, and she was wondering if her well's going to be going dry. So there's a very emotional need, and that's why I'm concerned about all these folks filing new applications. Is somebody's got a water right from 1870 or 1890, whatever. They have first right to the water, and if their wells or I believe Moab City has quite a few springs, if these start drying up, and you go to people in Spanish Valley that have been there for 5 years and say, oh, you can't suck up any more water, you got to figure out solutions to those things. And it's not a process you're going to finish now or even in a decade. Your kids and your grandkids will probably still be thinking about this.
I was just going to say, Steve, the problems that you're talking about are some of the major concerns, at least with me. And I've been working long and hard to fix them and get people to do some things. It will require some edification for you on the things you're talking about right now. I probably need to sit down and explain to you a little bit about the water rights law and what's going on currently in the valley. We're in the middle of an adjudication process, and water rights holds the key, not the city. So if we get you on the board, you, me and Mike or whoever probably needs to have a half an hour conversation about the history of the last 3 years since that USGS report came out and where we stand right now.
That'd be good, because my knowledge of Utah water rights is pretty limited at this point. But I'm an excellent researcher.
And Steve, I don't know if this was provided in the packet, but you have a degree in environmental science and an MBA. Is that correct? That's your education?
Yes. Yes, primarily environmental chemistry. And then starting in 1986, I founded my own lab. So I've been self-employed doing environmental chemistry since then.
That's what I wanted to ask you. That's what I wanted to ask you a little bit about. American West, that's in Salt Lake City. I thought that Sorensen lab was the biggest lab in Salt Lake City, and you were a small competitor compared to them. I actually have a degree in chemistry too and worked as an analytical chemist when I was just a young thing. I actually knew some people that were working for American West 40 years ago or 20 years ago, whatever it was, 30 years ago. Is that laboratory, have you sold that laboratory, just out of curiosity?
Yes, I did. I sold to my partner about 6 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah, we did a lot of work in Moab, actually, when I believe there was a filling station on Main Street that had some badly leaking gasoline tanks, and the water flow was carrying it south towards the river. One of our clients did the sampling, and then we did the analysis on that for quite a few years.
So you did a BTX analysis, PTEX analysis for that, as well as probably some TPH, but mostly a lot of the work you did. So when we start talking water chemistry and the difference that when we start talking water chemistry, which is very important, discerning between the several aquifers, you'll fit right into that discussion and won't have to be edified on that at all.
Yeah, the different salt levels and trace minerals and things like that.
Because you guys did that drinking water. You ran the suites for drinking water as well as anybody with UPDES permits, things like that.
Yeah, drinking water, wastewater.
Yeah,
we did a lot of well water monitoring for different sites, and we've done a lot of work in Moab.
Okay, okay. I remember
Steve,
that now.
Steve, Arnie, this is awesome. I want you guys to know years ago, we go hiking the San Rafael Swell, and I get ahead of my party. And this is what I would typically pull out of my backpack, because I was trained as a physicist and engineer, but I never knew enough chemistry. I would literally pull this book out. Yeah. And people thought I was crazy, still do. But it's fascinating, fascinating. So I'm glad to have two pros who can teach me more. So it's great.
It's
Thank
fun.
You, as Mike mentioned, one of the things we'll be doing this year is working on that 2016 update to the water conservation plan that you read through.
Yes.
Do you have any questions for us about that or about anything else? Just in anything really at this point.
So one question I did have, when you were talking about the gray water recovery and usage, and you talked about commercial uses where it may not be possible to use all that gray water. Do you know if the sewer plant, if the discharge from the sewer plant, if the water rights for that have been filed on by the county?
Levi, do you want to answer that? Do you want me to answer that? Levi, do you want me to answer that? Do you want to answer that?
Go ahead, Arnie. I couldn't hear the question.
So, Steve, the state owns the water. The state owns the water coming out of the wastewater treatment plant. Right now, that water is owned by people downstream. Somebody could file on it and put a change of application on it and get that water. Okay, but right now the state owns that water, and it's not Moab City's water just because it's coming out of the wastewater treatment plant. They would have to apply for rights on that.
Okay. I asked because Las Vegas has filed on their wastewater, and they are able to draw additional water out of Lake Mead using those rights. And that might be a possibility for Grand Valley.
At this point in time, the most preferred use by what was historically been talked about is using that wastewater to keep the wetlands wet. The problem right now with that wastewater is that it's treated for tertiary treatment for nutrients. And we would need one more treatment system to take the phosphorus and some of the ammonia and nitrogen out of it before you could put it into the wetlands, because it wouldn't make permit limits on reuse for wetlands at this time.
Yeah, we would also need a different distribution system for any of that water. So it requires a second treatment plant that's intensive. It would need to be pumped upstream, and it would need a second distribution system. So some or like water communities like Las Vegas or in California are exploring secondary water, or like maybe secondary water for that kind of for the wastewater use. But at this point, it just is prohibitively expensive for a lot of folks, especially in Utah.
Yeah, I was just thinking if the San Juan County, the 5,000 acre feet that they want to draw out of the river, if Moab had filed on 100 acre feet or 1,000 per year, you could join forces and include that in that whole system.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a long time in the future, I would assume. I don't know much about the San Juan project.
I think, Steve, that the county owns rights to 3 cubic feet per second out of the river. And they've never used that because it's expensive to pump it up and have to go up to well, I don't know about Ken's Lake, but anyway, storing it and pumping it has been a showstopper so far, but that could come into play.
With a shortage, certainly Mike's right.
Right, yeah.
In the future, it might suddenly become quite economical because we the water.
Yeah. I don't want to dive into the weeds too much here, you guys, on some of the specifics with water rights in here, because we could go on for days about that, because we do go on for days about that. Just for clarification, though, Grand Conservation, the Grand County Water Conservancy District, that 3 acre feet, when we get more water in Mill Creek than they currently have rights to, they transfer that water over and keep putting it into Ken's Lake on the very wet years in Mill Creek, Mike. So they do actually use it sometimes.
Oh, well, that's a different way of looking at it. I hadn't thought about that part.
Let's not get caught up in the weeds.
Yeah, let's don't. So, Mr. Chair, maybe we be time to move on. Steve, I want to thank you so much for applying, and nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you guys.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Steve.
So do we, do I sign out now, or should I wait for something? Or?
I think that Summer can put you back in the waiting room. Here we go.
Okay.
All right, Summer, let's bring Eve out. Steve and Eve.
Carly, are you getting feedback on me? Is that why you keep muting me?
Yeah, I think you are accidentally unmuting yourself, and we can hear some static.
Okay.
That's
I
the only.
think so. Okay.
Eve, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Uh-huh.
Hi, you guys.
Hi there.
Hi, Eve.
We
Hi.
could do introductions, but I think Eve knows all of us. Is that true?
Yeah, I think so.
I guess, yeah. Welcome back, Eve.
Yeah, thanks.
I guess I can start off, but I'm sure the rest of the board has plenty of questions for you. But Eve, why don't you tell us about your interest in being on the water board?
Right. Well, I think that I have the background of the water conservation plan and the work on the forest plan and the public information campaigns that we did in the past, and well, just all that experience from the meetings for a couple of years. And then I think that my skill set is sort of complements the scientists, because that's definitely, as you know, not my strong point is the science. I'm more of the interpretation of the data that would be understandable by a layperson. So I guess that's how I'm hoping I can help out with the board. If the work plan entails creating public information stuff, I think that I can help in that way for sure. And also because I spent a lot of time on the water conservation plan in 2016. If that's on the agenda for this group, then I think that I certainly have that under my belt to help with.
Can I ask you, Eve? I'm well aware of your talents. Why do you want to come back and be on the board?
Right. Well, it'd be nice. I used to get paid well to do this stuff, but I think it's like, I spent all those years building libraries, and I know so much about hose bibs and drinking fountains and carpet, and it's just all gone by the wayside because I just had never used that information, and I feel like I have all that information in my head about the water and the USGS study and the Colm report and just kind of where we're at in the situation with how do we determine what our build out capacity is, and just all of that. It's all still there in my head. And this is a good way to make use of it. And I can't say that I can remember everything that we went over, but it's just a good way to serve. I will disclose that I do work part-time for the city, taking minutes for the city council. And I did talk with the HR director about if it's a conflict of interest to serve on a volunteer board like this. And she said it was fine. Does that help?
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah. Do you have any questions for us at this time, Eve?
Yeah. Olive, I think.
Yeah. Go ahead, Mike.
I'm sorry. I just want to say I think you'd be a great addition in that venue, particularly with your strengths, because we got some, water engineering freaks like myself, and Steve Getz is along those lines, perhaps. I mean, that's what he sounds like. And so we have yourself and Cara and Jeremy, and we do have a mandated report to get out, and your skills and interest in that will be a great thing.
That is, just to clarify something you did bring up, Eve, we will be working this year on the latest update to the water conservation plan, and that will be kind of a big primary focus. Is what we're talking about for the latter half of this meeting. And we'll have a schedule of assignments throughout the year that each board member will take on. So that would be a big part of the foreseeable work of the board, just so you're aware.
Right. Yeah. Questions for you. So Cara is the only person not here on the board?
Currently, yep. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. So I don't know. I mean, tuning into the city council meetings, it does sound like some water ordinance language is in the works, and there's still that overarching philosophical question about creating the, what do you call it, the hard demand or whatever it is, like the question of why conserve, is it so that we can develop more or maintain the quality of life of the people who live here, and just those competing interests with the southern part of the with northern San Juan and those newer stakeholders that are sort of nosing in. And then just that question that even came up last night at the city council meeting about it was the discussion of the resort communities, and how do you I mean, it's that question that we've asked over the years, like, can you actually limit growth based on water, which I would hope is a yes, but I think as we've seen, that's a tough nut to crack in terms of any successful limits on growth elsewhere based on water. So, I mean, I might be out on a limb there, but it's those enduring questions that I have.
Yeah, so Eve, I got a question for you along those lines. You know, I've been dealing with safe yield and pretty active in saying, hey, you know, the end of free water may be coming. And inevitably I get the questions about, well, it's the hotel's problem. It's over, you know, it's always somebody else other than myself who's got to conserve and so forth. And in other words, people, as you say, don't want, you know, just to spend hard-earned water on hotels and so forth and have to conserve themselves. Why do that? So what I tell them, all right, is that council has yet to reinstate overnight accommodations in the commercial zones. That's still left over from last year, and then COVID set in. And I know that we've been pursuing water conservation standards, you know, like, you know, the usual gray water systems, restrictions on landscaping. In other words, we're doing our part, I think, to enforce conservation measures on commercial interest as well as residents. And I would like to think if would pacify, so to speak, residents who are mad about increasing demand from commercial interest. So if you got better suggestions about how to do that?
Not so far, but it's certainly an important question that deserves the input of this group. I mean, we're the ones that think about these things.
Okie dokie.
So
Well, you guys, I think the rest of you guys have all been around at least as long as I have, or longer, I'm sure. But I can remember when Bonnie and I moved to town, about 2002, and Eve was in the middle of making a new library happen. And I was so stunned that this woman virtually single-handedly seemingly was making a great thing like the library happen. I would follow her straight to hell without a question. Okay, so I'm delighted that you're applying, Eve. So
yeah, I would say it wasn't single-handed. The library board was heavily involved. I do have a question about the sustainability director. I thought that there was a search, but I didn't see that it was an open position, and I'm wondering if that is something that's happening. Hiring a new sustainability director?
There is not yet. There was an opening for several weeks, and we got some candidates, and we're taking the next steps after the position has closed.
Great. Yeah, it seems like with the water conservation education effort, that'll be great to have that kind of professional on board.
Well, if no one else has any other questions, and if Eve, you don't have any right now, we can put you back in the waiting room.
Okay.
But thank you for coming, and thank you for your application, and yep, we'll go from here.
Thanks. So I actually just leave the meeting, right?
You can just leave the meeting.
Okay. All right. Thanks, guys. Good to see you.
bye.
Okay. And just to confirm, I assume is the case that Beth is not available at this time still?
I do not have her in the waiting room yet.
Okay, right. If there's any further discussion we'd like to have right now about these two candidates, otherwise I think before having making a bigger recommendation, we should at least give the opportunity for Beth to show up during this meeting or a little later on during the meeting. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that, on how we proceed at this point? Or any other thoughts on the two candidates that we've just had conversation with?
I think that's a great idea. If she comes in the rest of this meeting, that's great. But let's make sure we give ourselves 10 minutes to make a recommendation one way or another at the end of the meeting.
Sounds great. We'll do that. Okay. On to item number 5, Water Conservation Plan Update. We're here to discuss the schedule and potential assignments. And with this are 3 documents that Carly put together. Would you like to speak to those at the outset, Carly?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Let me even pull them up to remind myself what we had in mind. This is actually a document that we kind of presented last year when we introduced the update for this group. And like I'm happy, what I'll do is I'll share my screen so we can all see it. Can you see that, guys?
Mm-hmm.
So what this has is like the components of what our plan needs to contain per, I don't know if it's state statute or Department of Water Resource criteria. I can't remember exactly. I think it is state statute. A lot of this is already contained in our plan, so it will just merely require some updating, like our system profile, like our supply numbers, how much water we're using, our billing statistics, and how much, you know, just, I guess, the housekeeping of our water portfolio. These are items that city staff can supply, so I wouldn't want you to worry about populating the plan with this information. It's, you know, it's actuarial. It's just stuff that we will pull from our treasurer's office and from our engineering team. The part that really needs a lot of development is conservation practices. And what I had in mind when Cara and I were first thinking about how this plan should be developed and how the water board can be best used, we thought that developing these practices and policies would be really, really valuable with you. So like stuff like, what is our ultimate water use reduction goal in the next 5 years or 10 years? What is our plan to implement? What like education and training practices do you want? What kind of ordinances and standards, codes and requirements? So when I was speaking to Cara last year and then to Jeremy a couple weeks ago, we thought it might be nice to sort of populate these conservation practice categories with specific things in mind. So for example, new development requirements. We could say hotels, we want them to have gray water capabilities. That's an example. Or ordinances and standards. We're talking about a water shortage contingency plan. Put that in there. And have each of you sort of take a number of these programs or policies or standards and develop, you know, the description of the policy, the amount of water we might be able to conserve, if that's quantifiable. It can also be like a value or qualifiable in description, and then some discrete action steps that need to happen, like who owns this, what does it have to go through? Like, is it a planning commission, city council, staff issue? Is it simply administrative? Is it something Joel can implement, for example? So what I have, and I'm happy to change this is just a starting point, but as we're discussing, we can talk about the different kinds of things we want to include in this plan and maybe who we want to own them for the development of the plan. Does that make sense? And then a schedule here for which topic we would tackle at different meetings. What I have in mind is we would do like policies to develop. We want to audit high quantity users, for example, and say we assign that to Arnie. Arnie would come back in March at the next meeting and talk about what kind of policy he has in mind, how much water he thinks we can save, and what kind of resources and action items we need to accomplish it. Does that make sort of the structure of this discussion make sense to everyone? All right. That's all I have, Jeremy, if you want
Okay.
to.
Would you mind not sharing? Well, I guess we can keep your shared screen up. I just can't view my agenda, but that should be okay for now. So I think the real question here is, do we want to dictate how we go about this month by month by, for example, priorities we identify here or personal interest in a topic which to research? It does sound like, a couple of these could fit well within things that we're already working on, individuals are already working on, or potential future board members are already working on. How do we feel about assigning a month-to-month priority? Does anyone want to volunteer, in other words, for a particular area of focus? And do you feel you want to take, I think we just, maybe it's in this document right here, you identified March as being the time to give out assignments, or do we want to just move ahead and see what people are willing to volunteer for at this point?
Yeah, I had February for we like make assignments. This is all very flexible. This is a first draft. And like March, I felt like we're kind of easier questions. It's going to be the ordinances and the codes and incentives that get really tricky and need a lot more information. Again, I think around August is when we want to have this to water resources. So we are on a bit of a timeline. However, what could happen is we could do a combination of the two. Like if after this meeting, you guys want to make the assignments amongst yourselves, via email, or Jeremy, you want to sort of give those out, we can do that. And then we can adopt those in March and also talk about policies and planning and studies. So there's certainly flexibility.
Well, I guess I'll ask the folks who are here, the board members who are here now, if there's anything that stands off on the top of your head, as something that you would want to be working on at some point before August to provide this kind of step-by-step approach to revising the water conservation plan that we've been talking about. Do you have a particular area of interest? I know we did go through this once before. I think it was last summer, as Carly said, and we gave out, to some degree assignments, but I suppose at this point, the goal would be to become more refined and have, some writing done within the next few months.
Well, Mr. Chair, just looking there how I can do something. Part C, as in Charlie, planning studios, a grand water management plan, and studies on aquifer health and water availability. That's, that is the closest fit to my particular interest.
Mm-hmm.
And like
water, yeah. As a council guy, then maybe the third part there, the water shortage contingency plan as well. All that's really is coming out of Carly's office as much as anything.
That's true. I can do that, and then by all means, you can give me assignments too. You all don't have to do all of this. I just want to give you the opportunity to be authors if you want to. And of course, we can remove things and we can add things. So if I didn't capture something fully, I apologize. And I was just trying to remember what we've been talking about over the past year.
Okay.
I'm going to talk here for a second. Can we perhaps get rid of D and just put it under those two things that are in D under E? One of them's in there twice already.
Yes. Some things are about, I don't know why this is the way it is in the, on the water resources page, like what the difference is between codes and ordinances. Like, I think this could be like building codes is what I thought. Maybe that's what they meant. And some things like apply only to new development. Does that make sense? So, but they, like new development would be ordinances.
Right, yeah.
Right.
Well, if that's the case,
we could also do this, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Arnie, do you have any particular interest or thoughts or feelings or guidance? I know you discussed recently Orion's involvement, of course, in the health department and
Yeah,
gray water.
you're gonna give Cara the landscaping ordinance. You may as well just type
Yep.
her in there right now. She may not be here, but you're gonna type her in there right now.
That's why we should give her all of the assignments. She's not here.
We've done that before. I would be happy to work with Orion on the gray water ordinance, and I do have some experience in the green infrastructure ordinances type things. And not all of them are ordinances. Some of them are just planning ideas there. So if you want to put me on the green infrastructure, that'd be great. And although I don't have a lot of expertise at this point in time in new development, plumbing, and high efficiency requirements, I'm pretty sure I can find that out. And I'd be happy to work on those 3 items. Okay. I personally think that the time of day, day of week water ordinances, you're going to need, at some point in time in the future, we've had this discussion, we're going to need to fall back on them. But I don't think we need to put them in place at this point in time. But we need to have them in our back pocket when we do get to the water shortage contingency plan. So, and it's kind of the time of day thing is kind of it's already cut and dry. You have that model ordinance out there, and it's about sprinklers. There really isn't much work to be done there at this point in time. Carly, do you see a lot of work to be done on that ordinance or the way it's written?
I kind of do. I want to make sure that we're appropriately tailoring it to Moab. Like if it's something that needs to be phased in with time, or we need to make incentives available, or there are exceptions that need to happen. So for this one, we are planning like a public engagement process for this over the next couple months to vet it and to see if we can develop it. Certainly, like you're absolutely right, Arnie, time of day, day of the week, will need to be implemented in the case of a shortage. It would just be much more restricting, right?
Yeah. So
get 1 day to water instead of 3 or something.
Yeah. So it sounds like, Carly, the administrative staff has taken off on this and isn't really, the Water Conservation Board isn't really part of it at this point in time.
We definitely will be. What we're doing is we're going to be doing public engagement and bringing a draft ordinance to you for review and input. So you will be part of the vetting of it, as well as it's sort of going between staff and the city council and the public. So you're part of that engagement.
Do you want me in on the front end, farther in on the front end than that, or do you want me in on the back end?
I want you kind of in the middle. We're going to present a draft to the council, hopefully February 23rd, and then I'm going to have a draft for you all at your March meeting.
Great.
Okay.
Do
I'm good.
The municipal operations, would that fall under something staff would take on in this case, or was the idea otherwise? Or where do you find those?
Where are you? Remind me where that is.
Oh, just F. Leak monitoring and pipe replacement. Is this something we could lean on Levi for, or?
Absolutely. This is city staff.
Right.
I'll put Carly. Like Carly just means city staff too. How about that?
And Arnie mentioned just below that, you can enter his name. You're welcome to put my name down as well. I'm happy to collaborate there.
I'm gonna count on you for that, Jeremy.
Absolutely. I can't, unfortunately, just the nature of my screen, I can start to see the incentives and rebates and rewards section, but I don't know if there's anything below that.
There is public awareness and education. And of course, we would do the Carly, really Lisa.
Mm-hmm.
But we did have, for irrigation and landscaping, I do, I had in mind Cara would.
Yeah, I think she volunteered herself, or at least has had a lot of good direction, a lot of good things to say about that public awareness and education. So I would put her down there until she has the chance to speak for herself.
And then low flow, I feel like, well, sorry, I thought some of these are still repeats, but they're not.
Jeremy?
Yeah, go ahead.
And Carly, so there's a new potential subject in here related to irrigation best practices, and that is that in-stream flow.
Oh,
Moab Irrigation Company, I'm on the board there. They, as you guys know, they have 4,000 to 6,000 acre feet of surface water rights, basically all the surface water rights to Mill Creek. It's a pretty primitive distribution system and it's not very efficient. But lately I got a request. Well, no, I got a request from Dave Engelman, who's the guru, if you will, of that group, wanting to know, trying to remember exactly what it was he said, but basically I put him in touch once again with Emily, the mayor, and we in turn got in touch with Laurel Hagan. She was a gal who's I think finishing up her last year in water law school, and she's a pro at this sort of thing. So the last chain of letters, Laurel had promised to get back to me. I haven't heard from her lately. I'm sure she's busy with school. About oh, that's what it was. Dave wanted to know what sort of to write into the bylaws for the irrigation company relating to in-stream flow. He's trying to manage a lot of competing interests and so forth. But the whole notion of using secondary water rather than good culinary water in the city, as well as stream health considerations, those are both great subjects. So you can put me down there, I guess, is to help negotiate this little thicket, but there's some other people involved as well.
Okay. Well, we should keep in mind that we'll potentially have a couple new board members. You can put me down for doing some research on rainwater harvesting programs. The rest of the incentives and rebates and these programs, I don't know if the city's done any research on these yet, or for now we'll just assign these to folks willing to accept a position on the board, just as a way to move forward for now. And maybe we should, especially when Cara is back next month, and ideally, I suppose, having 2 new board members next month as well, we could just double back to this and make sure we're all on the same page and go from there.
so what we can have, this is great. And of course we can continue to populate this. This does not have to be the final, discussion about it, but why don't we plan, it looks like Mike, you and me are going to have some drafted language for the next meeting about these. And I'm happy to send you an email after, Mike, so you remember the topics. And what I had in mind was, where is it? Like this kind of template. And this is also a starting point. It's like the proposed policy, the description of it, description of potential water savings, and we start to do actions required to implement. And, we could take an hour at the next meeting and just sort of workshop it. What actions are we forgetting? What are unintended consequences? Is the methodology for the water savings calculation correct? Or, and just incorporate those and basically start to draft this in a meeting.
Okay, sure. So Carly, give me anything that I should have written and have available to the rest of the group by the next meeting. Ping me a week or 2 ahead of that. So if I find out I'm supposed to write a long paragraph, I'll have time to write it.
Yeah, I'm so happy to do that. I'll contact you like 2 weeks before, and it's just like this sort of rough outline of it, like what it is and what we hope to achieve and how we do it.
Okay.
And kind of pitch in to develop it. But happy to do that. So yeah, someone will have to remind me too. Summer, you have to remind me to write mine.
Okay.
Okay. I can stop sharing.
Okay. Let's see. Okay. Well, that gives us some momentum moving forward. Like I said, I think it'll be good if at the next meeting, we can have a full board on board to discuss and adjust and decide how we're moving forward with each of these items. But I'm personally looking forward to being able to workshop something, as Carly just said, to give us this kind of stair-step momentum as we move through the next handful of months up to the water conservation plan revision. So if anyone else has any thoughts on that process at any point, or any recommendations, just like Arnie and Mike added to the conversation as we were just discussing, let's make sure to do that as we move along. Nothing's set in stone, but having a framework is really valuable. So thank you for your work on that, Carly, as well as Cara, and giving us some momentum moving forward here. I know we have next on the list, the draft shortage contingency plan ordinance, discussion and possible action. What did we want to say about that? I'm just bringing it up now myself.
So this should be a relatively straightforward ordinance. This is just a draft of it. You'll notice that there are some parts left out, like which code we're going to sit it under if it's ultimately passed and everything. But what it does is it merely authorizes the city council to, it authorizes Joel or a city manager, whoever it is, to develop a water shortage contingency plan, which would be a much longer effort. That would probably be many months that it would take staff and you as the water board and the city council to develop our plan, our tiered plan in case of a shortage. I mean, I'm happy to hear any thoughts that you have on just this ordinance authorizing the plan developments. But specifically, I am very curious to hear your thoughts on like warnings and fines, as well as the appeals board. If right now as written, if someone receives a fine because they violate some part of the water shortage contingency, right? We lose a big source of water if someone keeps watering their lawn, even though we don't have the water. I have like a graduated fine schedule in there. And anyone receiving the fine would be able to appeal. And my proposal is that they appeal to a group of 3 of you. So a group from this board where they can plead their case, and you can either choose to uphold or sustain the fine. And that's basically the structure of this ordinance. Any thoughts about it?
I'm unmuted, aren't I? I do have some thoughts about it. First of all, there is definitely a water shortage contingency plan necessary for the city. There's no doubt about that. If Levi were to lose 1 or 2 wells for whatever reasons, and all of a sudden we didn't only had the spring water and we were in the middle of summer, we would need, or we had a real problem with the distribution system, it would be great if we had a ready-made plan to deal with that kind of shortage. And that makes sense that everybody knows what's going to happen, as opposed to us reacting to be proactive on coming up with a plan what to do for an immediate shortage if we have a public works infrastructure disruption. Okay, because those things have to take place immediately, or you won't have water in your fire hydrants.
Yep.
Yeah, so that this plan is great, and we do need the ordinance there so that you can develop it. That's what you're actually saying at this point in time, is that city will develop with this ordinance. We will be able to develop the other ordinance. The other bigger thought in the back of my head is, when do we start dealing with drought? And it's an interesting facet to me that we don't own city owns water rights, but the state owns the water. Okay. And at some point in time, there's going to be a groundwater management plan out there that's going to say, okay, we're at sustainable yield, and this is how much water you guys actually have, and so on and so forth. And then if we do have a drought, we're going to have to figure out a way to cut back systematically. And I don't necessarily think that in that situation, the city manager, it might not be the person to make that call. It might be also be in the case that the Division of Water Rights makes the call that you're in a shortage. And then the city manager will take steps in this direction is what I'm saying. Somewhere I think you ought to include the fact that the Division of Water Rights can tell you not to use so much water, and this plan could take care of that. Somewhere in there, it's got to be mixed in. Does that make sense to you, what I just said, Carly? It's not just the city manager that's making the call on the water. It would also be the Division of Water Rights that might do that in the long term in terms of a long-term drought.
Exactly. So I really appreciate you bringing this up, Arnie. So like the shortage could because of a either a failure of infrastructure, a contamination, or a drought. So especially like a year like this year, where the snowpack is bleak, you know, we're all sort of bracing for a really hard summer. Either because we want the city manager to be able to react either because the Division of Water Rights is saying you can't use water, you know, we're clamping down, or because just our wells are low or the aquifer is low, it's not recharging. You know, being able to respond to any one of those situations and saying, I have this shortage caused by a drought. This is where the cuts are made, right? Or I'm projecting a shortage. I'm worried about in July, I'm going to have a shortage. So I am going to be cutting back on landscaping in the city, on city properties. We're not going to water our lawns as much because I want to mitigate the drought, or make it just not as severe, right? So we want them to be able to respond to an emergency as well as brace themselves and prepare or mitigate an oncoming emergency. So.
Okay. And this is just giving the opportunity for a contingency plan, not the actual devil's in the details, what the plan would be. And I'm not sure I want to get into the devil's in the details right now. The other thing you asked about was fines and such like that, and 3 people on the water board to discuss that, which is outside of city staff, which makes sense to me to some extent because it takes city staff out of the question, so to speak. Insulates the city staff from the decisions made. And I like that idea. We're not the first city to face something like this. What have other cities and municipalities done in this vein?
So I took this structure from Salt Lake City, who has a similar model, authorizing it was the Department of Public Utilities to develop their plan. Then they adopted the fine schedule. And they also have an advisory board, the Public Utilities Advisory Committee, who sits on that appeals board if they have to levy fines against someone for not following the water shortage contingency plan or any of the orders in it. And Arnie, I really appreciate your comment where when it comes to levying fines, it protects city staff, right? Like the city manager or the treasurer might levy the fine, but then the appeal is with you, the advisory committee. I think it protects staff and it protects the public too, those getting the fine, right? Because you're seen as you're an independent, objective party, seeing whether it was fairly levied, if it was just, knowing all that you do about the policy going into the shortage contingency practices, but also understanding the perspective of a community member. So.
Yeah. Yeah. So let me see if I can throw this much out. I can think of 3 big entities in the area for whom conservation might be an issue. Groundwater is one. In particular, their irrigation farmers out there. I'll get back to them in just a moment. Second one is Moab Irrigation Company, and they're 100 and some odd users, many of whom are city residents, but there's a couple up on the mountain and some farmers out farther south in the valley that either use MIC water or they water out of Ken's Lake. And then there's the city themselves. Of those 3 entities, the last couple of years, the one that I've seen take the most active role in conservation is groundwater, all right? Because, for example, this year, the lake is already very low, just barely above conservation levels. Spring flows are low because the snowpack is way below normal, dry last year and so forth. So they're already making plans to ration their ag users, irrigation users to 40, 50, 60% of what they ordinarily are entitled to and shoot for during the year. And even so, the water in Ken's Lake after the spring refill season probably won't be enough to get them through the irrigation year. So they have to go back to pumping. So they've been purchasing water rights from private users out there and spending some money to rejuvenate old wells or drill new ones and so forth, just to try to get them through this year's next irrigation season. And so for them, conservation is a very big deal. The irrigation company, by comparison, is sitting pretty, all right, because we typically have plenty of water in the creeks the first half of the year, and then in a dry year, the creek flows grow low, and we can't, because of a really crappy distribution system and habits and lack of good infrastructure. Typically, we can't keep enough water in the creeks during the last half of the year, and we'll start to pump on some wells, the Schumacher well, and some others out there, not too far from the diversion dams. They're pumping out of the valley fill aquifer, and we have to pay groundwater. But the water actually belongs to the Water Conservation District. So we will probably do that again this year, unless all of a sudden we get a whole bunch more snow before we know it and so forth. But the irrigation company right now is still making plans to plow full speed ahead. Okay, I might take issue with that. All right, if everybody else is conserving and they're going full speed ahead, it kind of looks bad, even if they can manage it. And then down in the city, we have all species of users, people who are very cognizant of water shortages and will be happy to cut back and do what they can. But more typically, there's a user like my neighbor whom I won't, who's a great guy, all right, but he's going to water as long as he can get the water, okay? As long as there's water in the pipe, he doesn't give a flying phooey about broader conservation easements. If the water's there and he can afford it, he's gonna use it. So distributing the conservation problem around equitably is an issue.
Well, Mike, I got a couple comments on that, and one is that when Grand Water and Sewer, and we're going to get in the weeds a little bit, does curtail their secondary efforts, it really does hurt several of the large farms out there, and those bigger water users that have greater shares in that water from the GWSA, that secondary water from the GWSA. But the other people that are residents on 1 acre or less or whatever they're on, they can just turn to the regular drinking water and use that. And they do on and off and on a basis. So Grand Water and Sewer is trying to get as much of their secondary water as they can, as cheap as they can. And sure, they're going to say your secondary users, you're only going to get 60% of your secondary water. But what happens in reality after that is that the smaller, not the farmers, but the smaller water users are just using their water, their drinking water on landscape, which is pulling it out of the Glen Canyon aquifer, which is kind of a problem for us at this point in time, because that's where the city gets all of its water. But I get the gist of what you're saying in terms of conservation. And as far as Moab irrigation goes, the way that water laws are written, and we're all well aware of this, is that if they don't use the water, they got to give it back at some point in time. So it's a double-bladed sword, so to speak, with an irrigation company to save water.
But it also promotes waste, all right?
Yeah, it promotes a lot of waste. And one of the ways, if we really wanted to get serious about increasing our amount of water in the valley, we would be looking at using the Moab Irrigation Company water for secondary water and putting it in a pipe and putting pressure on it. And that's somewhere down the road, 10, 15 years from now, Mike, that's where we'll probably end up going. I'd like to see that sooner than later. But I guess I'm a little concerned about conservation at this point in time. I'd like to start teaching conservation habits. And I think these plans that we need to have out there so that people know what's coming at them at some point in time are great. But I agree with your neighbor next door at this point in time. As long as there's water out there right now, we should just go ahead and use it. The Division of Water Rights is still allocating water out of our aquifer, even though we all know it's way out allocated. So I've got the double-edged swords there is like, well, if I don't use it, somebody else will, is really true at this point in time.
Yeah.
But it is a little different for cities.
Yes, it is. And the other thing is that, Mike, the ordinance that she's talking about would only apply to municipal water users from the city of Moab. It wouldn't apply to people that are on GWSSA water. It wouldn't apply to Moab city residents who are on GWSSA water. Is that correct? Because there are a fair number of them. And it wouldn't apply to the Moab Irrigation Company because that's a separate entity too. So what I'm seeing with this conservation ordinance is that everybody's conserving in the city of Moab on the city of Moab water, but nobody else is required to conserve throughout the valley. And that's part of what, Mike, I think you're getting at this point in time.
Yeah, and that was, if you do recall, we have on that conservation plan update, there was one item that was about like valley-wide conservation efforts, coordinating with WISA, with the Moab Irrigation Company, to discuss shared programs, shared values, which takes time. You know, and the water right question, when it comes to use, of course, it's different for Moab Irrigation than it is for Moab City. Moab Irrigation has to use them, you know, they might forfeit after 7 years if they don't use it. They're not putting it to use. That's not
the city
true.
won't. Yeah.
The city takes, you know, is it 40 years? You know, we can plan for, it's like 20 or 40. So we have a longer horizon, certainly. And, there was another point, you raised a really good one, and I wanted to thank you for it, but I can't remember. I swear you did. But yeah, when it comes to these kinds of plans and strategies, when you're looking at something like Moab Irrigation, they have different stressors than something like the city of Moab. And this is about making the city of Moab's water resources more resilient and more sustainable, right? So there's the larger question of the aquifer and its integrity, certainly. But there's also something about like how we're managing our portfolio and our demand. And that's what sort of the shortage contingency is about.
Like I said, I don't have a problem at all with the way the ordinance is written, that we do need to have a shortage contingency plan. There's no doubt about it. And I'm in full support of pretty much the way it's written, Carly, at this point in time. What you've demonstrated to me is the appeal process seems to work for Salt Lake City. Has anybody actually had to appeal? I don't think they have.
You know what? I don't think they've had to implement the mandatory restrictions.
Yeah, they haven't had the yeah. So that kind of things we're in good shape with. And I'm assuming that what we're planning on in terms of this point of a contingency is for contingencies, not for necessarily our current situation. And because currently right now, water rights tells us we have plenty of water. So I'm a little confused. I would be wondering why we would be trying to limit our water when water rights says we have plenty of water. But we do need a contingency plan. So I guess I'll just state it one more time. I'm happy with your ordinance to develop a contingency plan. And I think the idea of the fines not being large, but there being enough to slap somebody's hand and making them responsible for not paying attention anyways, or being brazen, whatever you want to call it, makes sense. You have to have some sort of stick out there to make people do this. And we'll talk more about carrots when we talk incentives later on. Okay. But I don't mind the stick. And I think the idea of a contingency plan is great.
Thank you.
What kind of motion are we looking for here exactly in particular, or is there one in particular besides, you know, general support or, yeah?
I mean, it would be a great motion if you just say like, we support this ordinance and we want this, you know, the city council to develop it. If you wanted to recommend an amendment to the ordinance, of course, we would take that into consideration. But I think the next place it will go is to the city council for probably passage. This ordinance is a little easier because it's just technical, right? It's just logistical. It's not policy. And the time of day of the week is a policy question, which will take much more time for this board and for the city council to hash out. So if you are feeling comfortable and to the point where you're like, we feel like we can support this to the city council.
One more question. Levi, you need a plan of action if we get low on water all of a sudden in a hurry?
We do have an emergency action plan, and it differs just a little bit from the actual plan, but we do. There's we'll rely on Grand Water, and we'll go door to door and shut everybody's sprinklers off. How's that? That's worst case scenario.
Would you like to see this ordinance so that the city has a different emergency action plan or a more robust emergency action plan at this point in time?
All the above.
All of the above. So this ordinance would help you.
It would.
Okay, I motion. I don't. Go ahead, Mike.
A question for you, Levi. I suppose you lost both your wells, and it's the middle of the summer, and you could effectively coerce all the residents into town into not watering their lawns at all, so your water consumption would look much like it would in the wintertime. Could you then water in the middle of the summer from just the springs alone without having to turn pipes on and off?
We can't hear you, Levi.
Did you get that, Levi? There you go.
Yeah, sorry, I reversed it. We couldn't effectively irrigate in town. We can sustain through the winter months just because we're not irrigating, and we don't have any of the deep wells running right now. We're just running off spring water right now. If something happened in the summer, we couldn't irrigate and do culinary at the same time. You do one or the other.
And keep water in the fire hydrants.
Yeah, that's the priority is fire protection.
I guess my question is, would you have, in order to keep water in the fire hydrants in the middle of the summer, just from spring water, do you have to go into a panic mode and going around, the west half of the town gets water today and the east half of the town gets water tomorrow, and you got to literally turn off valves? Or can you keep all the pipes everywhere full as long as residents have using just water from their culinary purposes and no irrigation water?
Yeah, that's definitely a worst case scenario.
It will work.
What's that?
I think Levi's saying maybe that is a scenario, not likely, but worst case.
That is definitely worst case. Okay, but because I've been wondering, Carly, about for me in your ordinance, that was the kicker. What was an essential use and what wasn't? Well, I guess fire hydrants would certainly qualify as an essential use. But
right, and that's the point of this exercise, right? Is to define those priorities. It's sort of like worst case scenario, we're doing fire flow. That's always going to be true. Fire flow has to exist for all of the stages. But then it's sort of like, do we, is it east, west versus, that kind of town? No outdoor watering, city parks can't water, no outdoor irrigation, community gardens can irrigate, but, cemeteries can't. So it is that's exactly the kind of discussion we want to have. How do we prioritize uses under different shortage scenarios?
Okay.
I'd like to motion we approve, or we recommend to the city council to approve this ordinance that gives them the opportunity to develop a contingency plan.
Thank you.
Carly, does that sound reasonable?
I think she's got someone in office.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'd be happy to second. I don't know if I'm in a conflict of interest position or not.
I said I made a motion to approve, to recommend the passage of this ordinance to the city council as it's a opportunity for them to develop a contingency plan.
And Mike? You said?
Mike seconded.
I said I'd be happy to second. I'm not sure if I'm in a conflict of interest position or not. You guys can tell me.
I don't think you are.
I don't think so. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Nope. Okay. The recommendation as a motion passes. Thank you for that. at this point in the agenda, we do not have anything further beyond returning to the discussion about potential appointment of new water conservation and drought management members. Yeah, Arnie, go ahead.
So am I still unmuted? I am. I wanted to bring up the possibility of before we're going to do that right at the very end, and it's not on the agenda, but I wanted to bring up the possibility of having Orion give us a 15-minute presentation at our next meeting about gray water, and maybe educate some of us on what the current rules are, what the current requirements are if you plan to use gray water. And at that point in time, I could use that, not only educate the rest of us, but I could use that information in what I'm working on in terms of gray water for the following meeting. Okay. And so Carly, if the rest of the board doesn't mind, if we can schedule Orion for at the most a half an hour. And I'm also going to ask you if Rosalind Brain, or not Brain anymore, but I can't remember her last name. Who actually has a gray water system that's being used at this point in time, might want to give us some insight on how it's working for her and what we could gain or lose by using her education and having a gray water system in terms of writing an ordinance. I might want to invite her also at this point in time, but that would be the way Orion would like to see this happen is, Carly, for you to send an invitation to them to attend the board meeting at a certain time and be a guest speaker. Okay. That's what they're asking for at this point in time, as opposed to being a citizen to be heard. How does the board feel about that?
I support it. It'd be great, especially if we have all the new board members on, and we can just begin a discussion in that way. And in addition to the maybe 1 hour workshop, we can have this presentation and still have room for another discussion item if we feel it's necessary. Okay,
so Carly, I'll let Orion know that he's going to get an invitation from the city.
Yeah.
Okay. That's all I had, Jeremy.
Okay, great. Well, do we want to have any further discussion about the two candidates that we've spoken with at this point? Does anyone have any thoughts about making a recommendation to the city as to those two candidates? We don't have to, as we said, we do this as we will. We don't have to necessarily give a yay or a nay to Beth, the third candidate who we haven't spoken to yet. But if we want to give yays or nays to these two, we can certainly do that now.
Yeah, if I may, Mr. Chair, let me offer this about Beth. I know Beth, and she knew right from the outset that, her potential schedule conflicts, not so much this summer, not so much this fall, but get into next spring, she's going to be hung up in Salt Lake most likely, and in a conflict of interest position about attending, and she knows that. And she couldn't make it again today. I mean, there's another conflict for her. So I think our other two candidates are very strong candidates. Nothing wrong with Beth. I'd appreciate her point of view as well. She would complement the other two as far as that's concerned. But if I have to make a choice, I particularly asked Beth if she was interested, because at the time we didn't have any other candidates. Okay, and even if she couldn't make every meeting, it was better than nobody at all. But given that we have two other viable candidates, I don't think she'll be upset with her if we go ahead and elect a recommendation of the other two candidates.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Does anyone else have anything you want to add?
I'm not going to make a motion at this point in time because we're still discussing it, but I think both Steve and Eve have the background necessary for this position and have a will to serve and the time available.
Great. Yeah, it sounded like Steve has a lot of great research experience, which would be very useful to the board, and Eve, of course, the institutional knowledge of putting together the water conservation plan. So I think they're both great candidates.
I echo that. Mr. Bailey, what do you think?
Kyle?
You there, Kyle?
Yes, I am. I am here. Can you hear me?
We can.
Yes.
I say yes.
I like conciseness, don't you?
Okay, well, then I would say that we could make a recommendation to the city and to the mayor to appoint Eve Tallman and Steve Getz as our 2 new water board members.
I will second that motion.
Okay, all in favor? Well, do we need to make a proper motion here, or is this just a recommendation, or how are we?
Motion?
Okay, so Mike seconds, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? None? Okay, motion passes. Well, does anyone have any items beyond what we've been discussing, which includes the first workshopping of text for the water conservation plan, as well as the potential presentation by Orion and maybe an opportunity for Roz McCann to speak as well, that we want to discuss at the next meeting? Or if not now, then between now and the next 2 weeks when Carly and I meet, just send something along. But that's what we'll look at doing, and also reconvening as a new and fuller board, hopefully by that point. Is that the case that we should have appointments if the city would be able to make that in time for the next meeting?
Yes, I intend to have both of those appoint those nominations to the city council for their February 23rd meeting. So
Okay.
you should have a full board again by March.
Okay, great.
See if I can
Where
talk
are-
one of them to be vice chair when they get here.
Where are we on a new water tank? We're talking about water shortages, but we need a new water tank.
You know, it's funny, Chuck just left, but Levi, is that what the water bond is for when we're discussing that water? So we're about to issue bonds for that we're getting financing for that project.
Very good.
And Levi, it looks like he knows more about it than I do. Do you want to speak to it?
Yeah, we have, that's on the capital improvement plan. We have 2 big projects. It's the Mill Creek water line upgrade. And then next would be, well, and then the redundancy well out there at the golf course area, as well as the water tank. Then we have to do the well first before we do the tank. So,
Levi, I thought we'd financed the well at this point in time. The financing was in place. So is there correct me if I'm wrong, is there a schedule on that at this point in time for starting and so on and so forth?
okay, so yeah, the finance part of it would be the design. The construction part would be included with the bond that we're currently applying for.
So we don't have a schedule until we have a bond.
Correct. We're in the final stages of the design, and it hasn't gone out to bid yet for construction.
Good question.
Okay. Anyone else have anything else you want to bring up before the end of this meeting? I know we're ending a little early, but that covers the agenda for today. Nothing else for now? Okay. We'll call the meeting to an end at 3:36.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.